means. So welcome everybody to the event that we're hosting in the MFA program for the great anthology, Shapes of Native Nonfiction. I'm here with Deborah Miranda and Theresa Warburton and Elissa Washuta. And we're going to hear from one of the writers featured in the, well, I guess two technically, but Deborah Miranda, who's going to read from her piece in the anthology, and we'll talk with Theresa and Elissa about putting the whole book together. So thank you for coming. It's also a happy International Women's Day, which is today. Welcome to those of you who are celebrating. Hopefully it's all of us. I should thank some people before we get started. One is the Dean's Office of the College of Arts and Sciences, who helps us put all of our events together. Thank you for their support. Also, as always, our hardworking MFA office staff, including Kimberly Garrett, our program assistant, and Micah Ballard, who's here, our administrative director, working the door, so to speak, along with Doug Powell, who I want to thank both of them for their help in keeping the meeting secure. So let's hear it for those two. This event is co-sponsored by the USF's Department of Critical Diversity Studies, and also by the Leo T. McCarthy Center for Public Service and the Common Good. So many thanks to them for their support in bringing our three writers together tonight. And while we're gathering here via Zoom, I want to acknowledge that our school, the University of San Francisco, stands on unceded, stolen Ohlone territory. The village of Yalambu is the territory of the Ramaytush-speaking people, one of 8 nations now referred to as Ohlone. Many of us who have come to benefit from this land still participate in the ongoing displacement of its original stewards, but we can choose to be better advocates and accomplices in favor of their restoration. And so here we are tonight as part of that ongoing important work. I'm going to put some links in the chat. I'll do that in a bit. I just want to make sure that you all can find links to the books we'll be talking about tonight, not just Shapes of Native Nonfiction, but also books that are recently out or forthcoming from all 3 of our writers. But let me give you an introduction of the 3 people we'll be hearing from tonight, and then we'll get started with the reading itself. Deborah A. Miranda is an enrolled member of the Ohlone, Costanoan, Esselen Nation here in California. She's the author of the memoir Bad Indians, which received the Penn Oakland Josephine Miles Literary Award. Her collection of essays, The Hidden Stories of Isabel Meadows, is forthcoming with the University of Nebraska Press. She's also published 3 poetry collections and co-edited the anthology Sovereign Erotics, a collection of Two-Spirit literature. Miranda holds the chair of Thomas H. Brodess Professor of English at Washington Lee University. Theresa Warburton is a non-native interdisciplinary literary scholar whose work focuses on native and indigenous literatures of North America and Oceania, exploring both the historic and potential relationships between literary production and radical political intervention. Her book, Other Worlds Here, honoring Native women's writing and contemporary anarchist movements, is forthcoming in April from Northwestern University Press. Her work has appeared in Studies in American Indian Literatures, Cultural Studies, Critical Methodologies, Upping the Anti, and Perspectives on Anarchist Theory, where she's also a member of the editorial collective. And finally, Elissa Washuta is a member of the Cowlitz Indian tribe and a Cascade descendant. She is the author of 2 books, Starvation Mode and My Body is a Book of Rules, and her new essay collection, White Magic, is out with Tin House Books also in April. She has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, Creative Capital, and the Potluck Fund. Washuta is an assistant professor of creative writing at Ohio State University. So that's our panel, if you will, for tonight. You are all on mute, as you know, for security reasons. If you have questions for anyone at the end of the event, you can feel free to text them to or chat directly to me. I'll receive them that way, or just put them in the chat. So we'll start with Deborah. Would you please, you're going to do some reading for us tonight. Oh, I think you're on mute. Oh, do I have to ask you to unmute? No.
I got it. Temporarily forgot. Since I live on Zoom, I temporarily forgot how to do anything. Thank you so much for inviting me today. And I'm going to read a little bit from Tuolumne. There's one word in this story that you might not recognize if you're not from California. It's the word rancheria, which is typically used in California to indicate a small Indian reservation. The epigraph from the story: Tuolumne River. My father took me there when I was a baby to show me the Indian River, and again when I was released from prison. We went to see the salmon. Al Miranda Sr. My father walked out of San Quentin after 8 years and somehow ended up at the Tuolumne River. My father's 44-year-old body was hardened, calloused, scarred, and tattooed with 8 years of fighting to breathe, stay unbroken, or at least stay alive. He still woke up nights in a cold sweat, fists coiled, pumped with adrenaline. Far into old age, he told me, he lived in fear that his release was a mistake, and guards would show up to take him away, lock him back up. But how did he get from San Quentin to the Tuolumne River, and why? Well, he didn't mean to make that trip. As to why, my father just went to see his father. They hadn't seen each other in a long time. Maybe my dad wanted to catch up. More likely, he wanted to borrow some money, maybe bum a place to crash until he could find work. But these two men, my father, Al, and grandfather, Tom, could not communicate. Oh, they both spoke English, but they also both spoke the language of pain, and for that very reason could not speak to each other. I don't know how my father got to his dad's house. He had no money, he had no car, he had nothing. Still in his lonely freedom and state of shock, my father found himself there in Stockton. Maybe Tom was out back in his garden lifting his prize cantaloupes up on boards so the gophers wouldn't gouge them out from beneath. Or maybe he was feeding treats to one of his dear dogs. Maybe they had coffee or a cold beer together. My grandfather was no angel, but he'd never been in prison. I suspect he was shamed by my father's incarceration, but then my father was always the black sheep of the three surviving boys. He would have been used to that. And my father wasn't the first family member incarcerated at San Quentin. His mother's brother, Cesar Robles, had done time there, convicted of manslaughter. He'd killed his wife for her unfaithfulness. My father said Cesar had beheaded her. I'm not sure that part of the story is true. Still, forgiveness was not a family trait. Al and Tom would not have enjoyed this reunion. And yet at some point, Tom said, "Get in the car." And because he had nowhere to go and no one to go with, my father did. He expected Tom to say something about the prison gang tattoos, the X between my father's eyebrows, the dark blue marks in the crease between thumb and forefinger. Tom said nothing, just backed out of his driveway and made his way to a freeway. They were heading toward the mountains. When they arrived, Tom steered the car down toward a cluster of tall trees, shaggy pines, and oaks. The two men stepped out of the car, felt the heat of the engine hanging over the hood, and then the embrace of cool river breath and liquid calls of birdsong. And in the river, the long, ancient bodies of salmon returning home, red and silver flashing in the green water, spotted tails pushing hard against the current. It must have been fall. That's when Chinook and Steelhead make their return up the Tuolumne. This is what my father told me years later. The Indians came to this spot, my grandfather said. My father was silent. He was stunned by the beauty of that place, the taste of wet air on his tongue, same air of his first breath when he emerged from his mother's womb nearly 44 years before. Stunned by the song of water, the explosive greens of leaves and pine needles, the scent of life. And now his father was talking about Indians. Tom Miranda spent a lifetime being silent about what was written all over his body, his former wife's body, and the bodies of their 4 boys. Family stories say Tom used to go to Indian dances, make his own regalia, but he never shared any of this with his boys. Indian was a dirty secret. You know, you were born near here, up at the rancheria. I brought you here when you was just a baby. The river, she was a lot faster in those days before they dammed her. A lot of salmon then. Your mother came up here because I was away logging and she had family up here. Her mother died around then and her grandma was real sick. She needed family to help her with Tommy and Richard. They was just little ones. My father knew this story. It was his personal creation story, the one that marked him different from everyone else. the sudden November snowstorm, the doctor sent for but stuck on the road, the Indian woman, a cousin, an auntie, who midwifed Keta, the doctor who finally arrived, exhausted, agreed the hollering dark brown baby was a healthy boy, stepped outside to sign the birth certificate, and collapsed, didn't get back up. That baby never registered with the US government, didn't officially exist until it was time to go to war, and he needed proof he'd been born before he could sign up to die. My father told me that he'd had to go back up to Tuolumne and find that woman who delivered him, get her to sign a document. My father was a little proud of this story, his outlaw birth. The Indians used to come here, catch salmon, big ones. This is the Indian River, Tom went on, looking out over the waters, hands in the pockets of his windbreaker. You come here when you have questions. You come here when you need. His voice broke off. Maybe he didn't know the word for what he wanted to say. Or maybe he knew the Indian word once but couldn't remember it, or remembered it but knew his son wouldn't understand the word, even if his father did use it. I wonder, was the word healing, cleansing, rebirth? Tom and my father stood there a minute, silent. Then Tom gestured at the river with his chin, an abrupt shark jerk. So, it was a move and a word that said, well, it's up to you. He wouldn't have touched my father on the shoulder, wouldn't have patted him on the back. The only touch shared between these two men had been blows. Tom turned, walked down the river a ways, left my father to it. When Tom walked away, he carried the remnants of a world with him. Languages, dances, tools, materials, songs, things he had never shared with any of his sons. This was the closest he would ever come to attempting that bridge. This is the Indian River. You come here when you have questions. You come here when you need. I don't know what my father thought as he stood there by the Tuolumne in the cusp between the 1960s and 1970s. Whether he prayed or asked for forgiveness or wanted to throw himself into the green waters and let it decide what to do with his body. His body. He carried 8 years of hell in that body. Did he think about what had been done to his body in San Quentin? Did he think about what that body had done to others? Did he hate his body for its weaknesses, for its needs, for its fears and angers? Could he even still feel his body anymore? Did he know his body as anything but a weapon or a target? Did he think about how long he could bear the weight of his body, heavy with the blood of others, stained with indelible loss and grief, curled tight as a fist around a handful of shame? Was he already thinking about where he could get a beer, start numbing the 1,001 blows to the innocence he'd once known that November night on the Tuolumne Rancheria, swaddled tight against his mother's breast? But my father never told me what he was thinking that day his father took him back to the river. What I do know is that in 2009, when my father was dying, he gave my brother this command: take my ashes back to that river. Scatter me on the Tuolumne. Something in that river called him back. Something in that water told him he needed to return to this Indian River one day, even if only as ash. Something told my father that here was the place he would lay down that battered body one last time, his bits of bone and cinders spread on a current that starts as snow somewhere in the Sierras. Something passed between river and man that day. Was it a promise, a plea, instruction? Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Deborah. That's great. I actually have a question for you about this essay because we did recently discuss it in my class. And one of the things that struck us, as we heard, is the sort of the uses of presence and absence in the essay, right? And how you deliver us to these really intimate moments, particularly between your father and grandfather, that you weren't at all present for. And there's, later with the delivering of the ashes, you talk about this also. Can Can you speak to sort of how in writing the essay you worked to sort of acknowledge the distance, but also work through it and kind of bring us to places where you weren't yourself?
Hmm. I think it's a process of immersion on a lot of different levels. I, s- I spent a lot of time thinking about and kind of reliving the moments when my father would tell me these stories and, what he sounded like, what he smelled like, the little accent that he had that wasn't, quite an Indian accent and not quite a Spanish accent, the sound of his voice and the words he would use. So just kind of immersing myself in the memory of his presence, really. And then kind of imagining how this scene might have played out for him with his father, knowing that their relationship was difficult as well, and thinking about all the secrets that my grandfather kept from his sons that we didn't find out about until much later. So yeah, it was a kind of a process of emotional immersion, and then writing down a lot of things as much as I could remember of every sensory detail, and then going back and kind of just letting the conversation kind of start, and it just felt like I knew how to do that after I'd spent so much time remembering how my father talked and what he talked about. So yeah, I don't have a lot of technical stuff to say.
Okay. Yeah, because it's great because you have that. There's so much that hinges on that one unfinished sentence, like the sort of, and that gives you the space where you can kind of imagine
Right.
the things that are being unsaid, and then that's sort of a place for you to come in as the person seeking answers, or looking to sort of maybe not seek answers so much as just sort of dwell on the mystery or something.
Right. I think that's one thing that I really learned when I was working on Bad Indians was that it's okay to not know everything. It's okay to not know the answer, and then to just kind of use what you do know to wonder, to speculate, to have a series of maybes. And in a strange way, it's kind of like you're circling, and you get a little bit closer every time you ask a question. You get closer to what might have actually been there.
I love that series of maybes. That's useful.
Mm.
Great. So bringing in our editors tonight, you've talked in interviews for the book about its origins, coming from, you're both having taught a lot of native nonfiction in classes, and finding the process kind of difficult, but also a dearth of materials maybe. And I'm wondering if you could sort of tell us the story of how this came together, but particularly how maybe like what the difficulty was for each of you, and then how that informed your approach to this anthology as maybe kind of solution, or how you put it together as almost giving yourself the teaching aids that you wish you always had or something.
Yeah, I mean, that was a big thing for me when I was teaching in the MFA program at the Institute of American Indian Arts. Teaching nonfiction, we had our reading lists for our students being composed of books by, full books by mostly Native writers. And, there were lots of wonderful individual essays published online and in literary journals. And I was using those in teaching there, in teaching Native literatures at the University of Washington. But we really needed a book. We needed this anthology. And there had been, anthologies published in the past, but we wanted one that was reflective of the fact that so many Native writers were currently at work in nonfiction, either as a primary genre or alongside other genres, like Deborah as a poet. And so we just, really wanted, I think my colleagues felt the same way. We just needed a book. And so I kind of decided that, we decided that we had to make it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of the impetus also was, for me at least, was Elissa and I met because I brought her to Western to do a reading. And one of the things that we talked about after was the sort of impulse during the Q&A session towards like anthropological knowledge about Elissa instead of about craft, or, you know, the sort of things that you'd, I think, see people ask non-native writers. And I think Elissa and I were talking a lot at that, you know, after that event, but then also after that, as people who were both teaching Native Lit, about that sort of impulse towards that we talk about in the introduction, towards these anthropological readings of Native Lit, and that especially for nonfiction, that becomes this like lens through which a lot of students assume that they're going to approach the material, and that what we needed was both sort of the collection of work that was formally innovative, or that we wanted to highlight the formal innovations of, but then also a sort of critical piece that could be used to sort of push against some of those expectations that people were coming or might be coming to the literature with, right? Like not all students, but like some students. You know, I always say, like, I sometimes when I teach Native Lit, I always feel like there's a couple students who come expecting it to be sort of like Greek mythology, but with Native people.
Yeah.
And this is, and so I think we really wanted that. And as we talked, I think I won't, although Elissa and I speak for each other a lot, I won't speak for her here, but I think it was important for it to be a collaborative thing that we wanted to do together, also to build up our understanding of this material, you know, in a way that wasn't about mastery over something, but was about, you know, building knowledge together as part of a community.
Definitely.
Yeah. Oh, please.
Oh, you know, Deborah, what you said about, you know, not knowing, I think really, or not like, you know, not, I don't remember exactly what you said, but just not having to be certain or having to know everything. I think that was really, you know, part of our process too, not having to become experts on these essays. I certainly don't feel like an expert on these essays, but I feel like I'm, you know, really familiar with them and I love them deeply. And I think it was, you know, working together, we could go through this process of both coming in with, you know, we have really different academic backgrounds and expertise. And I think together, you know, Theresa's work in literary studies and my work in creative nonfiction, it was just so complementary and created this space where, you know, we didn't have to know everything, but together we knew enough to make this book, and, you know, quite a lot. And still we're able to be confident about not having all the, you know, the answers about what these essays are doing and what they're about, but just to approach with curiosity.
Right. Yeah. Which that is definitely, I think, one of the key gifts of the book is the way it invites us to read with that kind of spirit of like not having to know. I think I have it in my notes here. The way you talk about this in the introduction is trying to move the focus in Native nonfiction away from it's having to fulfill the colonial demand for Native information. You know, like nonfiction is to give us the facts of what life is like, and this anthology and what you're talking about is like, let's not try to pin down the facts of this, but let's look at like the how, not just the what, but the how. How are these being made? And this gives you the book's focus on forms and shapes, obviously in the title. Was this sort of like in your talking and planning of the anthology, did you begin from this mission or this desire to like, let's focus on forms, or did that come along once you just started grabbing and finding content? You're like, this is actually what we're seeing in the body that we have.
Form was the first thing. I was talking to our first editor at UW Press about my idea for this, you know, years before we actually started working on it. I just had an idea because it's always been I mean, as long as I've been writing nonfiction, form has been my obsession. And I knew that there were a lot of other Native writers working in nonfiction who were attentive to form as well. And I thought, I just knew so many people doing such interesting work that I, wanted to make this collection of essays that were, kind of form forward or form conscious. It didn't go anywhere until Theresa and I decided to work on it together.
Oh, why not? Or is this a way to segue to Theresa? Or what was needed next, I guess, is my
Well, I
curiosity.
think that's probably my answer, because I was just intimidated by the idea of, I guess intimidated is not the word. Like, I just, this introduction that we wrote together is not an introduction I could have written by myself. And it's, this framing, especially like the literary studies framing and the history of the way these discussions have been ongoing and where we're entering into it. I had a very vague sense of that, but I couldn't have even really begun that piece without Theresa's expertise.
I think that part of what brought it together really, like from that space to something, was the basket. And the form was always there at the beginning, but it was really a discussion about a particular basket that Elissa had gotten a chance to hold that made us, I think, say, oh, that's the connection here. Like, that's the physical connection. That's the material connection. Like, to be able to talk about form as something that matters and not just is important, but is like creates the world, right? So that like forms are not just something that literature takes on, but that literature gives to us also as people who engage with it or people who engage with the world. So like the form that a basket takes and is a form of storytelling, and also thinking about like the way that artistry like basket making has been deemed like folk art or things like that, felt like another analogy to sort of how, or something analogous to how on the literary side, I think things were being thought about as well. And I think that, at least for me, I mean, I remember that it was over text message, as most of our writing of the book happened, that Elissa was like, I just have this idea for this book. And I said, we could do that. And we didn't really know what we were getting into, I don't think, but,
No.
but we just felt so strongly that it had to happen. And then the basket piece, I think, is really fittingly what brought it all together.
Yeah.
Yeah, you in the introduction you call the basket, and it becomes a label for the essay as an art form itself, as an exquisite vessel, one that evidences the delicate balance of beauty and pain. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, those two things that sort of are either present in the basket or the basket can bring together, and the way that these things also are working together in the form of the essay, the lyric essay, the personal essay. So I'm curious if anyone could talk about maybe the place or the position of pain in your personal essay writing, or maybe perhaps even professional essay writing.
Yeah, I think I write about pain exclusively, it seems like, almost exclusively. I think that, as long as I've been writing nonfiction, personal nonfiction, I've been writing about, really significant trauma that I've experienced. And I think I've just been drawn to really kind of rigid, rule-based, even if the rules are arbitrary and I'm making them up as I go along, like rigid, rule-based, visible forms as containers that can allow me to hold on to something that is, for all of my 20s was completely uncontrollable. And you know, created a life that was like out of control in many ways at various times. I think form, like being, you know, every essay of course has a form, but for me, caring so deeply about the, you know, the formal construction of a piece and creating sort of like formal logic for all of these different experiences and recountings, like that has been really helpful for me in making sense of things, just containing things that were, you know, just sprawling all over the place.
Deborah, did you have any
Yeah,
thoughts as an essayist?
I was thinking about Elissa's. I mean, I know in your book that you have so many really interesting different kinds of forms, and I was thinking about how I have tried to sort of capture pain, because pain, I think pain is very elusive. Um, Representations of pain are very elusive. Sometimes the pain is inescapable, but I was just thinking about how, for me, it's always about trying to. It's a struggle to try to find the right language to talk about pain, almost as if I need a different kind of language. And I was thinking back to some of my earliest work, and it was always about finding an image or maybe a sensory memory that could kind of lead me into the right language. So I think that I tend more towards that lyric kind of essay writing or memoir writing. Maybe because again, writing about pain is really difficult. There really isn't. We don't really have the right language for pain, and pain is kind of indescribable. And so I need to find something familiar and some familiar doorway into that, into talking about it, to talk about what really can't be talked about at all. And so using imagery or using symbols. I keep thinking about my very first story when I was like 7 years old, and it was a horrific story. It was all about these little rabbits that kept forming families and having babies and then getting killed during hunting season. And that would happen over and over again, you know, and I mean, they should have sent me to a therapist right then. But, you know, there was something really significant happening in my life at that point. You know, I had literally lost my whole family at one point. I was in the presence of a sexual predator who was pursuing me. And there were a lot of things happening that I didn't have the language for. So I made up this story about, you know, hunters and prey. And I think that's just always been a very instinctive way for me to approach pain.
It's, you know, I'm thinking about how like physical pain, when we go to the doctor, I get asked over and over about the pain scale. You know, where's your pain on a scale of 1 to 10? Is it a throbbing pain? Is it a stabbing pain? Is it pulsing? Like all of these descriptions are like nonsensical. Like how do we even begin to describe, like name or make, you know, I guess like make sense of physical pain? It's impossible to sort of like simplify it even in a medical setting. So thinking about like how to evoke for a reader, or like give the reader a sense of pain, like put a pain on the page in a really meaningful way, I think does require what you're talking about, Deborah, like those like images and scenes and different ways of evoking. It's so complicated that it required, like, it's such a seemingly like universal everyday sort of thing as pain is just so hard to adequately capture.
And if you try to just write it out, I mean, in very graphic, brutal ways, it is so much less than what it really is.
Yeah.
It almost erases it in a way. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think our use of the term exquisite there, I'm thinking back to the editing process, and just that was part of a revision that we had done, I think, in response to a reviewer who was thinking about the word exquisite and wanting and feeling like it was sort of like delicate and like represented something too delicate than what we were trying to talk about. And for Elissa and I, that's where that sort of description came from about I forget now exactly what it was, but exquisite pain and something else beautiful that's exquisite, like saying that pain can be exquisite in this way of being like very specifically crafted and very delicate in some ways, like that we wanted to be able to emphasize that without this sort of like just romanticization of violence or romanticization of pain. That is, I think, another trope that's very common in the reading of Native Lit. And so that use of exquisite, I think we talked a lot about that word. And it was actually the original title of the book. And so it's very central to the work that I think we wanted it to do in the world.
That's great. I have a number of questions sort of about the ongoing workings of anthologies and just anthologies in general, but I wanted to make sure we got 20 minutes. If there's questions from the audience, you can use the raise hand feature. You can also, like I said, you can text me in the chat or just put it in the chat if there's any leading question or any questions, not leading questions.
Leading questions are fine too, though, if you know the answer to the question you're asking.
And just make it easier for everyone. Yeah. While I'm soliciting those, I'm not seeing any hands up right now. You've talked about how this came together, and you mentioned your first editor. I mean, can you talk about sort of just kind of how the anthology kind of got out into the world, what the almost the mechanical like behind the scenes for anyone who might be interested in this kind of act of scholarship, which is also creative scholarship?
Yeah, you want to start, or you want me to go, Elissa?
I'll start because I mean, the process of being in touch with the press started that day, Deborah, that we had that panel at AWP. Regan Huff, our first editor for the book, pulled me aside after and asked what I was working on. And I just said, like, I would love to make this anthology. And, you know, we kept in touch, but because I was also working at University of Washington, but it didn't, like, I don't remember the timeline exactly, but I know that Regan came back to me sometime later and asked again and said that I think she had said that the University Press Board was really interested in anthologies, and I just kind of was like, oh, I don't know, like that seems like something I can't do now that I know more now about how little I know about everything. That's probably not my project. And then mentioned it to Theresa. And do you want to talk about the proposal process?
Yeah, so we wrote a proposal for the anthology that went to the press and went out to reviewers and came back with positive reviews, and then had a phone call and signed the contract, and that was exciting. And then we had to start doing the work. And I remember, one thing I remember really strongly about the process was that at the time, Elissa and I both lived in Washington, so we could see each other relatively often, but that changed as the course of the book went on. So one of the only times that we got together in person to talk about the book was this, I don't know if you remember, Elissa, there was this like huge storm up here. It was like this big windstorm, and we were supposed to go see a play about the Treaty of Point Elliott that's put on here by an organization called Children of the Setting Sun Productions. That's a Lummi production company. And it was canceled because of this huge windstorm. and it was, which to me is so important because it was this play about a treaty. It was like a fiction, nonfiction, like, you know, telling this story about this history. And Elissa and I sat down that night and said, what would our ideal sort of lineup look like? Like, what essays have you read lately that just like really blew your mind or that you think would be perfect for this? And we just made a spreadsheet of some of those essays that we'd read, and like what would be the sort of dream team. And then we set up a Gmail account and started emailing people. And then, you know, I think the bigger process, and maybe Elissa can talk more about that piece, because that, you know, really was her drawing on her community of writers, I think. But the process of writing the introduction was really an interesting one to go through together. We collaborated on it, and both like took pieces and did drafts. And then to this day, it's hard for me to remember like who wrote what parts of it, because of how that process was so just like back and forth and taking chunks. And we didn't sort of start from beginning to end. We just wrote different chunks of it at different times.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, so I knew, you know, from teaching a native nonfiction course at UW, and from doing the work I was talking about at IAIA, I had, and just, you know, being a native nonfiction writer and reader, I had, and also I was the Saturday editor for the Rumpus for a while, and had published a bunch of lyric essays by native writers through that. Or at least a few, maybe not a bunch. I published a few. And so, you know, I had all of these essays in mind, and I'd had these conversations with a lot of writers at IA about the need for this book. So I knew that people were going to understand what we were doing. And yeah, we didn't do an open call because we only had 80,000 words to, you know, and we had a lot of essays that we wanted to have in here, or, you know, writers that we wanted to ask for, you know, to share what they might have with us that would fit this this approach. So yeah, we just kind of kept track of the word count and kept track of who we were asking, and people were really enthusiastic and generous, and it, you know, it came together, I think, pretty quickly. Getting people on board was the easy part, then handling all the paperwork was the hard part.
Yes, that's the part that you're not told about, though.
Yeah.
Permissions and releases, and we learned a lot.
Yes.
And maybe an interesting thing for people to know too is just because I always think about the material object of books too, is that just the process of the cover was Elissa and I we just said like we wanted something like a basket on the cover, and then the press came up with this, and we were both so excited.
So excited.
How beautiful it looked.
Yeah.
So just like working with the right press, I think, and the right editor who, when they knew what we were talking about when we said something like a basket, that it just ended up looking so beautiful. And now I feel like our colors are now orange and yellow whenever we text each other. There's a lot of orange and yellow hearts.
Yes.
And we like didn't know until we got it that the inside was orange.
Oh yeah.
Until we held it in our hands.
So great.
Yeah.
Just
little things.
You all were, I'm sure, thinking at some point that you're making a book that's going to be taught a lot in schools and classes in the academy, as most anthologies are. And did you ever discuss sort of, did you feel you had a certain responsibility? Did you talk about or use the word canon at all? Or did you deliberately avoid that? I know the book itself is working to kind of open the canon up to writers who have historically been kept from it. But what are the ways in which you saw your work as anthology editors? And Deborah, you're having edited one yourself. How did you negotiate this relationship with kind of the established or traditional or the non-traditional?
I don't think we've really talked about it.
Yeah. I think one of the things that impressed me so much about this book is that it's not thinking about trying to resist or challenge the canon. It's just like a celebration. This is what we do. This is who we are. Look at how great this is. And then if it kind of has that effect on the greater, academic setting, that's great. But like even with sovereign erotics, I don't think we were thinking about how to massively, invade the canon. We were just like, we do things differently. Let's celebrate that. Let's, show it off.
Yeah, and I think Theresa and I were talking a lot about the fact that this approach was it was not new. It had been ongoing, and the basket was not a metaphor. This was a continuation of a tradition of craft and or attention to craft in a certain way that we felt was in relation to basket making. And I think that rather than thinking about the canon and being like in proximity or not to the canon, we were just thinking about the ways that that this has been, this approach has been going on for so long. So many Native writers have been working with form in such deliberate and interesting ways for years and years. And I think we just wanted to, kind of reflect a part of that was happening right now. And we were careful to not, label these as the very best essays or, the most perfect examples. It's true that these writers, I don't know all of these writers, but many of them are my friends. Like my friends are geniuses. So, it's just kind of a reflection of some of the writing that's happening right now. We could make 10 more of these.
Oh yeah.
I'm not suggesting it right now.
No.
There's one more, if not, yes.
Yeah. I think we also wanted to focus on contemporary living writers because it's something that, that was really important to us, was to focus on, and that, to me, that has to do with canon, because it's not just, Elissa and I we didn't really talk about the canon at all, but it's something that has come up in some reviews of the book, like that we didn't include famous nonfiction pieces or things like that. And obviously people are allowed to feel however they want about the book. But part of what we were doing was to think about what are contemporary writers doing now, and who are people that are like, that you could invite to an event, or people that are writing that you could follow their career, that you could talk to them as like contemporary people, and then to understand at the same time, like, what is the genealogy of nonfiction that is part of that. So without having like a really, really like monolithic divide between the sort of contemporary and historical, but without collapsing those two things either, if that makes sense.
It does, yes, thanks. We do have a couple questions from the audience, which we'll turn to before we go. I'm going to have Jake go first. They have a question. Jake, I think I've asked you to unmute.
Hi, am I live now?
There you go.
Yay! All right. Bonjour, Nika, Elissa. I am such a huge fan. I've read your work since 2016, and I can't thank you enough for sharing your art with the world. I really can't. So when I just had a question about, when writing about your past, what sort of situations call for narration closer to your character self versus your narrator self?
So I think that actually recently, as in the last few years, working on my book that's coming out next month. Oh my God. In my first book, the narrator is not really me. I mean, that's me kind of like frozen in a manic moment of, of my early 20s. And I was very much like working with persona it's all factual. It all really happened. I really was that person in a way, but it is also a construction of like a reconstruction of a dramatically intensified version of myself. I once that was in the world and I realized like a lot of readers don't see a difference between persona and person, I was like, okay, for my next book, I have to be a person that I can like live with for the rest of my life. And I mean, I'm much older now, and maybe not much older in years, but in my heart and mind, I have matured quite a bit. So I kind of made a pretty intentional effort to collapse those selves, the narrator self and the writer self. I feel very comfortable referring to, this narrator of white magic is me. And so I didn't need the sort of protection of a persona. I didn't need the I don't know, the sort of tension created by persona, whatever purpose I was using it for. I don't even remember at this point, but I made it a project to try to really accept myself and like make that person narrate the book. Part of that, like not having the protective shell of persona means finding other ways to take care of oneself while writing, which is a whole other conversation. But that's really, I think, the my best answer to that. I hope that sort of answered your question.
Thanks, Elissa. The next question is from Michelle Kilmer. I think I asked to unmute.
Okay. Hi.
Okay.
I was curious about Elissa. Thank you everyone for being here. It's wonderful. But I'm curious about the statement you made about making the nonfiction into like a formal argument, and sort of what you mean by that and how you work that into an essay, or is it form first and then I'm just curious about how you process that.
So at this point, it's very much intuitive. My process is really the same, almost the same in every essay now, where I'll be carrying a few words and then a phrase and then a sentence in my head for a long time and, tell myself I'm too busy to write. I got other stuff to do. I'll write this when summer comes, I'll write this over spring break. And then I write the first paragraph one day while I'm, in a meeting or something. And I just kind of, and then it's all in there and it comes out, and I don't know where I was hiding all of that. And then the form just kind of, it's kind of in there too. And I don't know where it is, where I find it, but then I put it on the page. That process comes from that. It was not always like that. That comes from like years of letting myself do what I wanted to do and listening to myself. When I first started writing nonfiction, I was reading a ton. I was reading so much work that, I was given in grad school by writers who were publishing essays that were doing things with form that I had never seen before. So I was just absorbing a ton and seeing all of these possibilities for form. And just with my first book, My Body is a Book of Rules, I really liked the idea of hermit crab forms, received forms, false documents, whatever you want to call them. We read a couple of those and I thought, oh, that seems like doable. I know how to write something in the form of a term paper or an online dating profile or, you know, whatever, an annotated bibliography. So I did kind of start with, like, you know, had this sort of mental list of forms that were, you know, dominant in my life, and this sort of mental to-do list of things that I wanted to write about that felt pertinent. And then I kind of let them match themselves up when I sat down to write. So I think that that's, you know, that's how I started originally.
Great, thank you. Well, this is 6:30 and I'm not seeing other questions, but if there's one more question, we might have some time. But I also did promise those of the writers tonight who are on the East Coast not to keep them from bed too much. So I'm not seeing any. So I'm going to just say thank you to you three for all of your insights and your gifts and your words tonight.